The birthday party was in full swing when Javier walked through the front door, carrying a homemade chocolate cake decorated with uneven blue frosting and the words, "Happy Birthday, Tommy," spelled out in shaky letters. The chatter in the upscale living room seemed to pause for just a moment as heads turned toward the man in the worn jeans and faded polo shirt, his calloused hands gripping the cake plate a little too tightly. The house belonged to his ex-wife Sarah and her new husband, Dr. Richard Blackwood, a successful cardiologist whose Mercedes gleamed in the circular driveway alongside the other luxury vehicles. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over marble floors where children in designer clothes ran between adults holding wine glasses and making polite conversation about stock portfolios and vacation homes in the Hamptons. Javier had spent 3 hours that morning in his cramped studio apartment kitchen following a YouTube tutorial on how to make the perfect birthday cake. His rough construction worker hands had struggled with the delicate piping bag, and flour still dusted the front of his shirt despite his best efforts to clean up. But today was his son Tommy's 7th birthday, and nothing would keep him from being here. "Oh," Sarah said, her voice carrying that familiar tone of barely concealed embarrassment as she approached him. Her hair was perfectly styled, her dress probably cost more than Javier made in a week, and the diamond bracelet on her wrist caught the light as she gestured vaguely toward the elaborate dessert table. "Javert, you didn't need to. We already have a cake from Delacroix Patisserie." Indeed, there was already a magnificent 3-tier cake decorated with professional fondant work depicting Tommy's favorite superhero characters. It looked like something from a magazine, nothing like the lopsided creation Javier held in his weathered hands. "Where should I put this?" Javier asked quietly, his eyes scanning the room full of faces that seemed to be studying him with varying degrees of curiosity and pity. Richard appeared at Sarah's side, his arm sliding possessively around her waist. "Hey there, Javier. Thanks for coming." His voice was cordial but cool, the kind of politeness reserved for uninvited guests. "Why don't you just set that on the kitchen counter? The kids are pretty excited about the real cake." The words hit Javier like a physical blow, but he forced a smile and nodded. As he made his way toward the kitchen, he caught fragments of whispered conversations that seemed to follow in his wake. "That's the ex-husband. I heard he lost his construction business. Poor Sarah, having to deal with all that drama." But Javier had learned to ignore the whispers. His focus was on finding his son in this sea of unfamiliar faces and expensive clothes. He spotted Tommy near the fireplace, standing slightly apart from a group of children who were comparing their new gaming devices and talking about their family's upcoming ski trips to Aspen. Tommy's face lit up when he saw his father, and he ran across the room with the kind of uninhibited joy that only children possess. "Dad, you came! Did you bring the cake?" "Of course I did, buddy." Javier knelt down to Tommy's level, not caring that his knees creaked audibly or that his worn sneakers looked out of place against the pristine marble. "Happy birthday, son. 7 years old. You're getting so big." "Can we cut your cake first?" Tommy asked, his voice filled with hope. Before Javier could answer, Sarah's voice cut through the moment. "Tommy, sweetie, we need to do the official cake cutting with all your friends. Daddy Richard's cake has the candles already on it." Javier watched his son's shoulders slump slightly, but Tommy nodded obediently. It was a small moment, barely noticeable to anyone else. But Javier felt it like a knife twisting in his chest. He remembered when Tommy used to insist on having 2 birthday cakes every year, one from Mommy and one from Daddy, and how they would all laugh together as Tommy tried to blow out 14 candles instead of 7. That was before the divorce, before the business failed. before Sarah met Richard and discovered what real financial security felt like. The official cake ceremony began with great fanfare. Richard lifted Tommy onto his shoulders so the boy could blow out the candles while everyone sang and cameras flashed. Sarah beamed as she cut perfect slices of the professional cake, serving them on fine china plates while the adults complimented the presentation and the children dove in with enthusiasm. Javier found himself standing in the corner, watching his son laugh and play with children he didn't recognize from families he had never met. This was Tommy's world now, a world of private schools and country club memberships, tennis lessons and sailing camps, a world Javier could never provide. "Excuse me, are you Tommy's father?" Javier turned to find an elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun. She wore a simple but expensive-looking dress and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to respect. "Yes, ma'am, I'm Javier. I'm Eleanor Whitman, Tommy's teacher at Brookfield Academy. I've heard so much about you." Javier felt his stomach tighten. Parent-teacher conferences at the prestigious private school were always awkward affairs where he felt like an imposter among the other wealthy parents. "I hope Tommy's doing well in class." Mrs. Whitman smiled warmly. "He's exceptional, but more than that, he's kind. He's the child who notices when someone is sitting alone at lunch and invites them to join his table. He shares his snacks with children who forget their lunch money. Last week, he gave his favorite pencil to a new student who was crying because she didn't have any school supplies." Javier felt a warmth spread through his chest. "That sounds like Tommy." "He talks about you constantly," Mrs. Whitman continued, "about how you taught him to ride a bike in that little park near your apartment, about the camping trips where you tell him stories under the stars, about how you're teaching him to use tools and build things with his hands." The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's voice calling for attention. "Everyone, if I could have your attention, please. Richard has a special announcement." The room fell silent as the successful cardiologist cleared his throat and pulled Tommy close to his side. "Sarah and I have been discussing Tommy's future, and we've decided it would be best for everyone if I officially adopted him. We want to give him every opportunity, every advantage, and we think it's time to make our family complete." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Javier felt the blood drain from his face as the implications sank in. Several guests murmured their approval, clearly thinking this was a wonderful development for the young boy. "We've already spoken to our lawyers," Sarah added, her voice steady but not meeting Javier's eyes. "Given Javier's financial situation and housing instability, we believe this is what's best for Tommy's future." Tommy looked confused, glancing between his mother and the man who had been more of a father figure than Javier could afford to be. The boy's eyes found Javier across the room, and in that moment, Javier saw something that broke his heart completely. Tommy was waiting for him to fight back, to say something, to prove that he mattered. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because what happens next will show you the true meaning of a father's love. But Javier couldn't speak. The room seemed to spin around him as the implications of what Sarah had just announced sank in. Adoption would mean his parental rights would be terminated. It would mean Tommy would legally become Richard's son. It would mean he could disappear from his boy's life completely. Mrs. Whitman stepped forward, her voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence that had fallen over the party. "I'm sorry, but I couldn't help overhearing. Sarah, as Tommy's teacher, I feel obligated to share something with everyone here." Sarah's confident expression faltered slightly. "Mrs. Whitman, I don't think this is the appropriate time. Actually, I think it's the perfect time." The elderly teacher's voice carried an authority that came from decades of commanding respect in classrooms filled with entitled children and demanding parents. You see, Tommy wrote an essay last week about his hero. Would you like to know who he chose? The room was completely silent now. Even the children had stopped their chatter, sensing the tension in the adult conversation. Mrs. Whitman continued, her eyes never leaving Sarah's face. He wrote about his father, not the man who buys him expensive toys or lives in a big house. He wrote about Javier, the man who works 16-hour days in construction just to afford the modest child support payments that help pay for Tommy's school. Javier felt his throat constrict. He had never told Tommy how hard he worked to make those payments, how he often went without meals to ensure the check was never late. Tommy wrote about how his dad taught him that a man's worth isn't measured by his bank account, but by his character. He wrote about how his father never misses a school play or a soccer game, even when he has to leave work early and lose pay. He wrote about how his dad's hands are rough because he builds things that matter, things that last. Sarah's face had gone pale, and several guests were now looking uncomfortable, their wine glasses forgotten in their hands. Mrs. Whitman wasn't finished. But most importantly, Tommy wrote about the day his father found him crying because some children at school had made fun of his poor daddy. Do you know what Javier told him that day, Sarah? No one answered. The room waited. He told Tommy that being rich isn't about how much money you have in the bank. He said the richest man is the one who has people who love him for who he is, not what he can buy them. He told his son that love doesn't come with a price tag, and that any person who judges you by your clothes or your car isn't worth knowing anyway. Tommy broke away from Richard's side and ran to his father, wrapping his small arms around Javier's waist. "Dad, I don't want to be adopted. I want to stay your son." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Javier knelt down and looked into his son's eyes, fighting back tears. "Tommy, your mom and Richard can give you things I never could. They can send you to the best colleges, take you on amazing vacations. But they're not you," Tommy interrupted with the brutal honesty of childhood. "Richard tries to be nice, but he doesn't know how to fix bikes or tell stories about dragons or make funny voices when he reads books. And Mom used to laugh at your jokes, but now she acts like she's embarrassed of us." Sarah stepped forward, her composure cracking. "Tommy, that's not fair. I'm trying to give you the best life possible." "But what if I don't want their kind of best?" Tommy asked, looking up at his mother with eyes that seemed far too old for his 7 years. "What if I just want my dad?" The question hung in the air like a sword. Mrs. Whitman smiled softly and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've been teaching children from wealthy families for 35 years. I've seen parents who buy their children everything they want, but never give them what they need. And I've seen parents who struggle to afford basic necessities, but raise children who understand the value of hard work, integrity, and genuine love." She turned to face Sarah directly. "Tommy is one of the most well-adjusted, compassionate children I've ever taught. He doesn't need more money or bigger houses. He needs what every child needs, parents who love him unconditionally and show up for him consistently. Javier has been doing that since the day Tommy was born." Richard cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Look, I appreciate the sentiment, but practically speaking—" "Practically speaking," Mrs. Whitman interrupted, "love and presence matter more than bank accounts. I've seen too many children from wealthy families who grow up to be entitled, emotionally stunted adults because they were raised by nannies and babysitters while their parents focused on accumulating more wealth." She gestured toward Javier, who was still kneeling beside his son. This man may not have much money, but he has raised a son who shares his lunch with hungry classmates, who stands up to bullies, who says please and thank you without being reminded, and who treats the school janitor with the same respect he shows the principal. The room was completely silent, except for the sound of someone's wine glass being set down too hard on a marble counter. Mrs. Whitman reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Tommy, would you like me to read your essay to everyone? The one about your hero?" Tommy nodded eagerly, still clinging to his father's side. "Would you have stood up for your child the way Mrs. Whitman is standing up for Tommy right now? Share your thoughts in the comments below." Mrs. Whitman unfolded the paper and cleared her throat. My Hero by Tommy Martinez. The use of Javier's last name instead of Sarah's married name was not lost on anyone in the room. My hero doesn't wear a cape or fly through the sky. He doesn't have superpowers or a secret identity. My hero gets up every morning when it's still dark outside and goes to work building things that make people's lives better. His hands are rough, and sometimes they have little cuts from working with tools. But they're the same hands that taught me how to tie my shoes and help me with my homework every night. Javier felt tears threatening to spill over as Mrs. Whitman continued reading in her clear, strong voice. My dad doesn't have a lot of money, but he never misses my soccer games. He sits in his old truck and cheers louder than all the other parents. When I score a goal, he jumps up and down like I just won the World Cup. After the games, we go to the diner and share a milkshake because that's what we can afford. And it tastes better than anything because we're sharing it together. Several people in the room were now wiping their eyes, including some of the children who had gathered around to listen. My hero taught me that it doesn't matter if your clothes come from the expensive stores or the thrift shop. What matters is that you treat people with kindness and respect. He taught me that working with your hands is just as important as working with your brain, and that there's no shame in any honest job. Sarah's makeup was starting to run as tears began to flow down her cheeks. But the most important thing my hero taught me is that love isn't about buying expensive presents or living in big houses. Love is about showing up when someone needs you. Love is about keeping your promises even when it's hard. Love is about never giving up on the people who matter to you. Mrs. Whitman paused and looked around the room before continuing. My dad loves me so much that he works extra hours just to make sure I can go to the same school as all the other kids. He never complains about being tired, and he never makes me feel bad about costing him money. He tells me I'm smart and strong and that I can be anything I want to be when I grow up, even president if I want to. Tommy looked up at his father with pure adoration shining in his eyes. Some kids at school say my dad isn't as good as their dads because he doesn't drive a fancy car or wear expensive suits. But they don't understand that my dad is the richest man in the world because he has something money can't buy. He has a son who loves him exactly the way he is. The essay concluded with words that seemed to echo through the silent room. My hero's name is Javier Martinez, and I'm proud to be his son. When I grow up, I want to be just like him, not because of what he has, but because of who he is. Mrs. Whitman carefully folded the paper and handed it to Javier, whose hands were shaking as he accepted it. The room remained completely silent for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Sarah stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tommy wrote that about you?" Javert nodded, unable to trust his voice to speak. Sarah looked around the room at the faces of her friends and neighbors, all of whom were staring at her with expressions ranging from surprise to disappointment. These were people who valued success and status above all else, but even they seemed to understand that something profound had just taken place. Sarah started, then stopped. She looked at Richard, whose face had gone ashen, then at her son, who was still holding on to his father like a lifeline. I think we need to reconsider the adoption, she said finally, her voice breaking. I forgot what really matters. Richard stepped forward, clearly agitated. Sarah, we can't make decisions based on emotional manipulation. Think about Tommy's future. His opportunities. I am thinking about his future, Sarah interrupted, her voice growing stronger. And maybe Mrs. Whitman is right. Maybe Tommy doesn't need more opportunities. Maybe he just needs his father. She walked over to where Javier was still kneeling beside Tommy and extended her hand to help him stand. Javier, I owe you an apology. I got so caught up in trying to give Tommy everything I thought he needed that I forgot what he actually needs. Javier stood slowly, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. What are you saying? I'm saying the adoption talk stops here. You're Tommy's father, and nothing is going to change that. Not money, not houses, not anything. The room erupted in surprised murmurs as guests began to process what they had just witnessed. Some looked disapproving, clearly thinking Sarah was making a mistake. Others seemed moved by the display of authentic emotion they had just witnessed. Mrs. Whitman smiled and gathered her purse. My work here is done. Tommy, I'll see you in class on Monday. And Javier, you should be very proud of the son you've raised. As the elderly teacher made her way toward the door, she paused and addressed the room one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, I've spent my entire career around children from privileged families. I can tell you with absolute certainty that the greatest gift you can give a child isn't money or status or opportunities. It's the knowledge that they are loved unconditionally, exactly as they are. The party began to break up after that, with guests making awkward small talk and early exits. Several people approached Javier to shake his hand or tell him how moved they were by Tommy's essay. A few parents even asked for his business card, saying they needed some construction work done and wanted to hire someone they could trust. As the crowd thinned, Javier found himself alone with Sarah and Tommy in the now quiet living room. Richard had disappeared upstairs, apparently needing time to process what had just occurred. Daddy, Tommy said, tugging on Javier's shirt, can we cut your cake now? I want to try it. Javier smiled, feeling lighter than he had in months. Of course we can, buddy, but first let me ask you something. Are you sure you want to stay my son, even if it means we can't afford fancy vacations or expensive toys? Tommy looked up at his father with complete certainty. Dad, you're not just my hero because of what you do. You're my hero because of who you are, and I wouldn't trade that for anything in the world. Sarah wiped her eyes and managed a smile. Come on, let's all have some of Daddy's cake. I'm sure it tastes better than anything from that fancy bakery. They moved to the kitchen together, and as Javier cut slices of his imperfect but lovingly made cake, he realized that sometimes the most valuable things in life can't be bought or sold. They can only be earned through love, sacrifice, and the simple act of showing up, day after day, for the people who matter most. Have you ever experienced a moment when someone stood up for what was right, even when it wasn't popular? Tell us about it in the comments. Later that evening, after the last guests had left and the expensive decorations had been taken down, Javier sat on the front steps of Sarah's house with Tommy curled up beside him. The boy had fallen asleep against his father's shoulder, still wearing his party clothes, but clutching a piece of the homemade cake wrapped in a napkin. Sarah came out and sat down beside them, her fancy dress replaced with jeans and a simple sweater. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. "I'm sorry," Sarah said finally. "I lost sight of what was important. I got so caught up in trying to give Tommy everything that I almost took away the one thing he needed most." Javier looked down at his sleeping son and brushed a strand of hair from the boy's forehead. "We all make mistakes, Sarah. The important thing is that we recognize them and make it right. Mrs. Whitman was right about you," Sarah continued. "Tommy is lucky to have you as his father. I was lucky to have you too, before I forgot what really mattered." They talked for hours that night about their dreams for Tommy, about their mistakes and regrets, about the future they wanted to build for their son. It wasn't a reconciliation in the romantic sense, but it was something perhaps more valuable, a partnership based on mutual respect and shared love for their child. When Javier finally carried Tommy to his car, the boy woke up just long enough to whisper, "Dad, this was the best birthday party ever." As Javier drove home through the quiet suburban streets, he thought about Mrs. Whitman's words and Tommy's essay. He thought about the looks of surprise and respect on the faces of those wealthy parents, and how a simple homemade cake had somehow changed everything. But most of all, he thought about the truth that had been revealed that evening, that the greatest wealth any parent can possess isn't measured in dollars or possessions, but in the love and respect of their children. And by that measure, Javier Martinez was indeed the richest man in the world. The next Monday, when Javier picked Tommy up from school, Mrs. Whitman was waiting by the car with a smile on her face. "How was the rest of the party?" she asked. "Perfect," Tommy replied, beaming up at his teacher. "We ate Daddy's cake, and it was the best cake in the whole world." Mrs. Whitman looked at Javier with knowing eyes. "I'm sure it was, Tommy. I'm sure it was." As they drove away, Tommy chattering excitedly about his day, Javier realized that sometimes the most important battles aren't won with money or power, but with love, truth, and the courage to stand up for what's right. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, there are people like Mrs. Whitman who will stand beside you and remind the world what really matters. The homemade cake was long gone, but its impact would last forever. Because in a world that often values appearances over substance, wealth over character, and status over love, one father's simple act of devotion had reminded everyone present what it truly means to be rich. Family isn't always about blood relations or bank accounts. Sometimes it's about the people who choose to show up day after day with love that doesn't come with conditions or price tags. And in the end, that's the only wealth that really matters. Subscribe for more powerful stories like this, and click on the video on the screen to watch the next one with a twist so powerful you'll never forget it.